Hello, I'm Eric Cytrynbaum, and this is the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group Report for October 7th, 2021. Quick reminder of who we are. We're a group of academics and related individuals who are busy with other jobs, but occasionally producing these reports to analyze data in a manner independent of what's happening at the BC CDC and in the Ministry of Health. And our goal is to increase public knowledge of what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. So a quick overview of what we're going to see in the report today. First, our usual state of the pandemic plots to see what's happening with case data mostly there. We have some news that's kind of already in the news about what's going on with kids age 0 to 9, well, really, the unvaccinated under 12s. And we have some updates on that, or some comments on that. We have a new analysis of the testing rates in BC, which the protocols there seem to be quite steady over the last few months. So those are still good tools. Case numbers are still good tools for modeling purposes. Update on hospitalizations and what's happening with ICUs, and then some comments on vaccination and the impact, and also what's happening in the details of who's getting vaccinated. We also have some sensitivity analysis of the impact of transmission in kids as compared to other age cohorts, which has implications for how important measures are as they apply to the under 12 cohort or the older cohorts. And then a summary of some of the data that's available already on balance of risk in vaccination of children under age 12. And we have a few slides on the situation for Alberta, as well as some analysis of their testing data and other details. All right, so let's get started. So this is our usual state of the pandemic slide, produced by Jens van Bergman. And what you can see is this rise that we saw with the growth of Delta through August, and with the measures that were put in place, indoor masking and other things, including the vaccine card, we see a stabilization. So we're close to neutral there. We're just barely, well, I'll get to that a little later, but we're just barely decreasing in case numbers now across the province. So this is a slightly deeper dive into the case numbers. Here it's broken up by kids under 10 and kids and adults over 10. And what you see is in the 10 and above, you can see what I was just showing you in the previous slide, which is that Delta increase and then tapering off after measures are imposed. And here, this September 8th is indicating the start of school for kids. And what Jens is highlighting here is what looks like a transition from growth to plateau to an onset of growth again in kids once they got to school. Now, there's a lot of debate and controversy over that, and it's very hard to chime in on that debate because it is really unclear. So some have made the claim that this is due to changes in testing. There's been a rapid increase, a spike in testing among kids in that age group, which has been argued has led to this apparent increase in cases, as though they're just picking up asymptomatic cases that were missed with lower testing rates. That doesn't seem to be such a convincing argument. The consensus in our group seems to be that that's probably not what's happening, but it also doesn't seem to be exponential growth. What you see here, this apparent turnaround in the trend line, is probably not a meaningful turnaround, but what it does indicate is that the data, as you can see in the dots, are really spread out all over here, and they are not really growing exponentially. So it's beyond what could be explained by testing, but it's also not sustained growth. All right, so here we have another breakdown of the data, this time by health authority and with the under 10s and over 10s laid out. And you can see here the outbreaks that we had earlier in September are visible in the Fraser Health Authority in the under 10 category there. Same thing in the interior. We do see an increase in the under 10 group. In Northern, everything was increasing without that plateau, but now seems to be slowing down, or something is happening here. A little bit hard to tell at this point. In Vancouver Coastal, it looked for a little while like the under 10s were growing more rapidly than everybody else, but it seems to have quieted down, and we don't see that under 10 growth that we see in Fraser and in the interior. And in Vancouver Island, you can see it as well, with, again, a lot of spread of data here, suggesting that this may or may not be actual upcoming exponential growth in that age cohort. So another breakdown across the health authorities, and what you see in each of the health authorities is a pretty consistent picture, which is consistent with what we see across the province, and that is growth through August and leading to a flattening, with some regions still showing growth, in the north particularly, in Fraser East, but definitely slowing, and in the interior, a real flattening here, and the same in Coastal and Vancouver Island. So here are Dean Carlin's model fits and projections. So you can see across the province that that fit is coming out pretty clearly here as fairly flat, and I believe, I don't think it's written, currently at -1% per day. And so that's what we have for now. Now, of course, remember last year there was some kind of a change in late October where we started growing again, which was pretty late for that to be explained by schools. But it could have easily been explained, or could be explained, just by everybody closing their windows more, leading to a decrease in ventilation or something of that effect. Anyway, that's something that we should keep in mind and beware of, because we are not decreasing and we're still at fairly high levels. And so we are susceptible to any increases in transmission. All right. And again, just highlighting it, there's generally either plateauing or predicted decline. There was a small outbreak here that gets picked up by Dean's model as a special type of event. And Vancouver Coastal is declining, so is the interior. Vancouver Island seems flat, and there's some very slow growth in the north, about 1% per day. All right, so this is a new analysis provided by Dean Carlin. Dean was curious to know if the testing rates or the testing protocols had changed either intentionally or just de facto by how people are behaving and responding to things. And so he fit some of the data to a model. Here's the model here. And this is just a simple statistical model that says that we can predict the number of tests that will be made by the number of cases multiplied by some constant, and then add to that a constant term that is basically a parameter multiplied by the total population size, where this parameter is the chance of any individual getting a COVID test in a manner that is independent of how many cases. So this term here, the A times cases, that would include, for example, the more cases there are, the more people will be referred to testing by contact tracers. So that would get built into this term here. But also just generally people hearing about cases in their neighborhood thinking, oh, I've got some symptoms. Now that there's more cases, maybe I've got COVID, I should get checked, as sort of a case-induced reminder. And those would all get built into this term. But things like getting tested because you're going traveling, or just regular monitoring, would end up in this sort of constant, independent of cases component. And so what Dean's showing here is fits to those. Now, before January, the data does not really line up well with the model. But Dean's interpretation is that starting in January, the testing protocol was fairly stable and provides a good basis for calibrating the model. So what Dean's done, he's fit the model just paying attention to the data in the red band or the pink band here, and then continues with that same model all the way through the fourth wave. And what he finds is that in some regions of the province, you get a rise of the expected number of tests above what the model predicts. So that indicates that there's more tests going on during the fourth wave than we thought we would get based on people's behavior during the third wave. I should point out here that the data being used in these panels here include both publicly funded data and private testing data. So here is a different data set. This is data broken out by age and only available from April on. And what you see here is age 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and so on. And in this case, this is only publicly funded testing data. And you'll notice he's done the same thing here for each age group. He's used the third wave to fit the model. So in other words, choose the parameter A and, there's B1 and B2 because he breaks up into summer and non-summer months. So from July through September, he uses one B value. And before and after that, he uses a separate B value. And that's just because he's anticipating that the data may behave differently, especially for the kids during the months that they're not in school. And so he fits the two pieces in the third wave and gets parameters for those fits, and then just extends those fits out through the fourth wave and compares it to the data. And you can see for the 0 to 4 group, you can see that the case data is far above the prediction based on third wave behavior, but all the others, except for this recent spike in testing, all the others behave pretty well all the way across. And so that leads us to suspect that the private data is what was causing the overshoot. And there's some difference in private testing going on in Fraser and Vancouver Coastal that caused the third wave model to not fit the fourth wave very well in those regions. But when looking at just the publicly funded data, that works out much better. So what this tells us is that whatever Dean has been using as part of his model fitting process for the case data, the testing protocol has not changed dramatically from third wave to fourth wave. And so all of the calibration that he's got built into the model is still going to be useful going forward. Okay, so here we have an update on hospital and ICU occupancy over time. And I just want to call out a reminder here. The last time I produced a video, at least, there was an interim report that was only a PDF, and you can check that out. But in my last report, I talked about the fact that hospitalizations are not decoupled from case counts. And you can see that panning out here very clearly. We had a low dip after the alpha third wave, and then a rise again in delta. And at the time, people were saying that they don't see that same rise in the hospitalizations and maybe not even in the ICU here. But the case data is always lagged behind, or the hospitalization and ICU data is always lagged behind, I guess, the case data. And so you can see that here with the bump following later in the hospitalization data, and in the third wave, same thing. The peak is delayed. And again, here you can see this valley with the rise again is delayed in the hospitalization and maybe slightly less delayed in the ICU data, although that's a little bit tricky to interpret. And so we see that the hospitalizations are still, and ICU occupancy are still tracking case numbers with a lag, as they have been. And to show that in more detail, it's not here. That's on the next one. Here we have a projection for hospitalizations that is, pretty clearly showing that the model still works to predict or match to the hospitalization data. The model is just being fit to the case data here and using a simple conversion to get the hospitalization ICU, and it still does pretty well. And you can see that we're staying high and starting to drop, but it's, we're still under some hospital pressure, but at least it's been tapered off now because we've got the case numbers under control with the recent measures. Okay, and here's just a look at that hospital ICU occupancy ratio. We had reported that there was a disturbing increase in the ICU fraction. So in other words, of the people who end up in the hospital, it seemed like more of them were going to the ICU than before. So the fraction had been bouncing around below 40 and then finally went above 40 around the time just before our last report. But it seems to be, undergoing some fluctuations and returning down. So that is a bit of a relief. So that's not so indicative of an increase in severity as we had worried. How are we doing with vaccination progress? So it's slow. As you can see here, the progress on average is denoted by the black lines, and this is people with with 2 doses here on each of these dates, and this is people who've had single dose as of each of these dates, and you can see that just especially the single doses are getting closer together as time goes on, which means progress is slowing. So we have about a 0.5 and a 0.9 increase over the past week, respectively, for 1 and 2 doses. So there was a question that we addressed or 2 reports ago, I guess now, about what impact has the vaccine card had on vaccination rates. And you can see when it was announced here, this dotted line, you can see there was a jump from, the week before to the week after, which is not surprising. People were motivated to get vaccinated. That sort of tapered off or plateaued until the vaccine card enforcement began, and then we saw another jump again, with the 18 to 29s leading that jump most recently. But you'll notice at this rate, it would take 14 weeks to vaccinate half of the remaining 50 to 59-year-olds and 6 weeks to vaccinate the remaining 18 to 29-year-olds. So I just want to clarify what the data hit here, because it's slightly processed data. So what we're showing is the percent of unvaccinated people remaining in each age group who got vaccinated in that week. So as more people get vaccinated, the whole population that we're talking about here is decreasing. So the same number of people getting vaccinated have a larger impact on this in this plot. But it's kind of, in a sense, the right thing to show, because we want to know how much more of the unvaccinated population is still left to vaccinate. Okay, so we've seen this plot before. This one shows what happens as communities go from low vaccination rates down here to high vaccination rates. And what you can see, and I think this is becoming more clear with time, what you can see, especially with the fit through here, but even in the data alone, you can see that communities that are, let's say, 75 or 70% vaccination rate have higher average daily case rates per 100,000 people than do ones that are up here at 90%. So it's about 3 times higher average daily case rates here as compared to down here. So this is another new plot. This is a breakdown of who's getting vaccinated when. And so broken out by sex. So you can see here in the youngest vaccinated age cohort, 12 to 17, you can see so male and female are pretty much getting vaccinated at the same rates. And then by 18 to 29, the men have fallen far behind here, 4 weeks a lag in these curves. But as we look at older age cohorts, the male numbers are gradually approaching. By the time we look at the over 70 group, the 2 lines, it's not plotted here, but the 2 lines again coalesce. So I'll leave it to you to interpret what's going on there. It's perhaps a fun sociology exercise for those interested in those things. So we are now in what's being called the pandemic of the unvaccinated. And this slide and the next one explores what that means for children under 12 who are largely unvaccinated or almost entirely unvaccinated. So if you break down the unvaccinated population by age cohort, what you find is nearly 50% of them are under 12, and then the rest vary from, almost 0%, all the way up to about 12%. And, the rest of these will all add up to 50%, which is the full unvaccinated population. So what can we say about what's going on here for kids? So it's known that kids are less likely to be symptomatic, and the fraction of kids that are diagnosed that end up in the hospital is fairly small. It's roughly 1% in BC. But there's about 600,000, close to 600,000 kids under 12. If all of those get COVID and only half of them are symptomatic, 1% of the other half would still come out to about 3,000 hospitalizations. Just to give you a sense of scale, there have been approximately 10,000 hospitalizations throughout the pandemic for anyone, all ages. So that's almost a third of the total that we've seen so far would be pediatric cases over the time it would take for the whole population of kids to get infected. Now, this is assuming that they don't get vaccinated and we let the pandemic keep rolling the way it's been. And the question is, how long would that take? And that would be determined by what kind of measures we keep in place and what type of vaccination fraction the rest of the population has. So it's looking like vaccination is probably a wise thing for children, and I'll get to more on that in a few slides. So in this slide here, Sally Otto has addressed the question of sensitivity. Specifically, she asks, what would happen if we take the contact rate in any particular age cohort and increase it by 10%. So in other words, let's say release some measures on just part of the population and see what happens, and measure the result in the change in growth rate. And so what she finds is that for most of the age cohorts, you see a 10% increase in contacts would lead to an increased growth rate, but a fairly small increase in growth rate. So this corresponds to less than 0.5% per day in growth rate. If you do the same thing with the under 12s, that ends up being close to a 2% per day change, which is quite significant. So right now, for example, the overall growth rate in British Columbia is decreasing at about 1% per day. So this type of a change would be enough to flip that decrease to a growth. So why is that the case? Why are the under 12s so dramatically more sensitive? Was mainly due to a lack of vaccinations in that group, and also partly due to high contact rates among children. Okay, so looking a little bit more broadly, instead of just increasing by 10%, which is what the bar charts on the previous slide did, this graph here shows a whole range of possible changes in contact rates. And you can see the bar graph said an increase of 10%, which would put us here. And each of those bars on the previous slide would correspond to the values of these little graphs in here, all very low. And that one big bar for the under 12s would be this one here. But now you can see if we change the amount that we modify the contact rate, you can see what the change in growth rate would be. So this gives you an idea that just how sensitive the kids are to changing their contact rate compared to adults. So if you had to choose which group to apply measures to, the one that would give you the most impact would be the 0 to 11-year-olds. So we have this question that's coming towards us soon, which is, how do we evaluate whether vaccination of children under 12 is a good idea or bad? So the report from Pfizer says that it's looking like it's effective and safe for this age range, consistent with teens and adults. But the question is it in the best interest of children? So there's three things that we would worry about. These reports of myocarditis, which is a heart inflammation, issues with hospitalization, and we can include death here, although death is a very low probability event in both COVID infection and in vaccination for kids in this age group. So here we're just doing a comparison. So this is a cases per million diagnosed with COVID, and this is cases per million vaccinated with Pfizer. So the numbers here are not based on the 5 to 11-year-old age range, but instead on the next nearest, the older group just ahead of them, who have already been vaccinated and also exposed to COVID infection in significant numbers. So myocarditis occurs in 63 cases per million vaccinations and 544 cases per million diagnosed COVID infections. That's a factor of 9 difference between those risks. Hospitalization, again, 60 hospitalizations per million for the vaccination, compared to 5,000, which is more than a factor of 100. Sorry, not quite a factor of 100, just shy of 100 up from the vaccination risk. So clearly on a per infection versus per vaccination comparison, a COVID infection is far, far worse than vaccination. And the same thing is true of deaths, but I won't spend too much time talking about those because these numbers are very small and there's some uncertainty there. But we still have to say something about the probability of an individual getting a COVID infection, because that's really dependent on the context and time frame. So here is a summary or an overview of our analysis of that question. So let's just do a quick thought experiment here. If the probability of infection without vaccine were 100%, then obviously vaccination would be less risky than risking infection or not getting vaccinated. And if the probability of infection were 0, then obviously there'd be no reason to get vaccinated. So there's some place in between 0% risk of infection compared to 100%, where the risk of vaccination and the risk from infection are balanced. So for each of the risks that we're considering, we can calculate that percentage. And for myocarditis, we find that if the risk of infection is 12%, then those risks are balanced, which means that if the risk of infection from COVID is greater than 12, it's worthwhile getting vaccinated. And if it's less than 12, it's not worth getting vaccinated. For hospitalization, the breaking point is lower, is 1.3. And for deaths, the numbers are small in both cases, and that introduces a lot of uncertainty. So I won't really consider this. We just have this here for sort of completeness. These are the two risks that are really worth considering. So, okay, so how do we put this 12% or this 1.3% into context of what's going on? So right now, children under 12 are at higher risk of getting COVID than they've been throughout the pandemic. We have higher rates right now. Up until now, 2.4% of children under 10 have been diagnosed with COVID. And at the current rates, we would expect more than 20% of children to have detected cases of COVID within the next 2 years. So what that says is a risk of 20% is certainly greater than 12 or 1.3. So that means in the current context, the risk of vaccination is well worth taking because the risk of complications from infection are greater. So here we consider indirect benefits to kids. The previous slide was direct benefits to kids, keeping kids themselves out of the hospital for whatever reasons. Here we consider the fact that if kids get vaccinated, they contribute to our approach to herd immunity, bringing down the risk of infection and hospitalization and deaths for their parents or other caregivers, right? They're spending time with parents, grandparents, teachers at school, and so on. So with this consideration of indirect benefits, it becomes even more convincing that vaccination is worth it. The right way to look at these graphs here, so on the left panel of each of these three factors here, you see what will happen in terms of infections in the population broadly. If we don't do anything, we just continue as we're going right now. And you can figure out how many people are infected by calculating the area under this curve. And I'm not going to actually give a number for that. I'll just let you do it by eyeball. The second panel on the right here is what happens if we vaccinate 80% of the 5 to 11 age group. You can see here, that's a sudden vaccination. This is a simple model. So we suddenly vaccinated all kids November 21st, and we ask, okay, how does the infection across all of society change? And you can see, given that the area under this curve from here on out looks like it's maybe in the range of 60 to 70% of the original, that means that the parents or other caregivers of the children who are being vaccinated will have that much lower chance of suffering from infection and suffering from hospitalization or death. So now let's turn to Alberta. The next few slides focus on the COVID pandemic there. So Dean has run his usual fits, but this time with the Alberta data. And as you can see, they have introduced some measures which his model picks up as a breakpoint here in late August. And that has led to a turnaround with a projection going forward of a peak not much different from their December and May peaks. But the interesting thing here is that the hospital and ICU projections, which have been pretty successful at matching data from the alpha wave on, are now deviating pretty dramatically. So Dean wanted to check why that might be happening. So he turned to this testing model that I described with the BC data, but this time with Alberta data, doing the same thing, matching to their third wave peak, or the April peak. And so he fits the model to the data through the red zone here, and then continues the model out and sees how well it matches the data. And in contrast to what we saw in BC, you can see that the testing data falls below the curve. Now, the amount by which it falls below the curve, it doesn't look dramatic because the points are close to the blue curve, but the horizontal distance is not what matters. What matters is how far it is away this way, which is quite significant. So you can see that the testing is the model, in other words, the prediction based on testing behavior through the third wave is now over predicting what testing is happening. So this makes it look like there's an under testing problem going on, and maybe they're not picking up as many cases. This case data may be incomplete. Really, the case data should be going higher, in which case that would bring the hospitalization curve higher, looking more like what the data looks like. And so you can also see in orange here the unknown sources. So through the third wave here, you can see that the unknown sources in orange are not a big component of all cases in the province, but in the recent Delta wave here, you can see that there's a much larger fraction of unknown cases. So the suspicion is that it's diminished contact tracing, which is known to have been decreased over the summer in Alberta. So, okay, let's take a look at that in a slightly different way here. Dean has just taken the cases data and the hospital admissions data and scaled down the cases data by a factor of 30. And you can see that throughout the pandemic, it really does a pretty good job of matching, with some deviation here at the end where the hospitalizations way overshoot the case data with that scale factor. And that's true region by region. And so this suggests that, yet again, the hospital data is inconsistent with the case data. So what Dean has done, hospital admissions are kind of a pretty clear. You don't need a test. You have a severe case of COVID, you go to the hospital. It's not like, did you get tested or did you not get tested? Are we going to actually pick it up as a case? So he hypothesized that the hospital data was more reliable than case data now. And so he fit the model to the hospital data. And you can see that's quite a good fit. And then use that to figure out what cases would have looked like in order to get the good fit to the hospitalization data. And you can see that he's showing a clear underrepresentation of the number of cases. So all of this area here are missed cases. And you can see now that the ICU data and the hospitalization data occupancy. So this is hospital admissions and this is occupancy. And you can see that they now line up pretty well, at least for the third and fourth wave here. So, okay, so now that the fit is working well, you can see that it seems pretty clear that there's they've already hit a peak in Alberta and they're on their way down, and the projection is that this will continue, which is great news. So even though the contact tracing is not showing the truth of what's going on, in fact, it looks like instead of cases being below the previous peaks, they went quite a bit higher. The measures that they've put in place were enough to turn it around and bring it back down. So we can go over some of the key messages here by way of a summary. So first I'll talk about the state of the pandemic. So in BC, the COVID-19 cases stabilized through September, and that was due to the masking measures and the other public health measures, the vaccination card. We noted some rise in cases in kids in several of the health authorities, but not all. And that seemed troubling at first and is now maybe not exactly stabilizing, but it's not rising exponentially and seems to be less of a concern than it seemed like it might be. ICU demand remains high, but there's reason to believe that it's stabilized and possibly will be coming down. Our new analysis of testing indicates that cases still remain a useful tool for building the projections based on the case data. Then a summary of vaccination results here, or data. We see a continuing vaccination progress, but it's at a very slow rate. We have a continuing trend that we've reported before in which areas with high vaccination levels have notably lower case numbers. So children account for nearly 50% of the unvaccinated, and we see a corresponding rise in case numbers in some of the health authorities in BC. Our sensitivity analysis says that if you increase contact rates in children, that leads to larger changes in growth rates than it would for other groups. So in other words, measures applied to the children cohort under 12 would be the most impactful. And this is largely because of lower vaccination rates or non-vaccination rates in that group and high contact rates. So our analysis of the vaccination risks in children indicate that vaccination is worthwhile in the balance of risks. In other words, not vaccinating is higher risk than vaccinating, given our current situation. And this is already true with just the direct benefits to children, but we've also considered the implications of indirect benefits to children through the effect of vaccinating kids on adults. And finally, in Alberta, we found that the case data is no longer a useful tool for building the model, but the hospital data is, and this seems to be due to the drop in contact tracing. And on the bright side there, the hospital admissions have begun to decline, and it looks like things are under control. Okay, so that is our report for this this period, and we will be back with another report in a few weeks.